The morning sky splits open with the sound of radial engines, a mechanical thunder that rolls across the Pacific waters like an approaching typhoon. Through the dissipating clouds, they come. Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, their wings catching the first light of dawn, their rising sun insignias vivid as fresh blood against polished aluminum. The pilots sit in their cramped cockpits with the composure of samurai entering battle, their silk mawashi wrapped beneath flight suits, their final letters to families already written and sealed. Below them, American fighters sit wingtip to wingtip on Hickam Field and Wheeler Airfield, arranged in neat rows to prevent sabotage, a precaution that has transformed them into perfect targets. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya leads his fighter group in a sweeping arc over the harbor, and what he sees confirms everything his training promised. Chaos, confusion, American aircraft burning on the ground before a single pilot can reach them. His Zero banks effortlessly, responding to control inputs with a sensitivity that makes the aircraft feel less like a machine and more like an extension of his own body. When a handful of American P-40 Warhawks manage to claw their way into the sky, desperate and outnumbered, Itaya watches his wingmen engage them with an almost casual superiority. The Zeros turn inside the American fighters as if the P-40s are standing still, their 20mm cannons tearing through aluminum and flesh with surgical precision. By noon, the arithmetic of disaster is complete. 2,000 American dead, 18 ships sunk or damaged, and 188 aircraft destroyed, most of them before they ever left the ground. But the numbers that matter most to Japanese naval aviation are written in a different ledger. 29 aircraft lost against hundreds of American machines eliminated. The kill ratio is so lopsided, it seems to validate every assumption about Bushido spirit overcoming Western materialism. That evening, as the carrier group steamed back toward Japan, Zero pilots gathered in their ready rooms, their confidence hardened into certainty. They have faced American pilots in combat and found them wanting. What these men cannot know, what their moment of absolute dominance blinds them to, is that they have just initiated their own obsolescence. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not merely an aircraft, it was a philosophy made manifest in aluminum and fabric. First flown in 1939 and introduced to combat over China in 1940, it represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical engineering focused on a single, uncompromising vision: air superiority through maneuverability. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had been given an impossible specification by the Imperial Japanese Navy: create a carrier-based fighter with the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, the climb rate to intercept at any altitude, and the turning performance to defeat any opponent in a dogfight. The result sacrificed everything to achieve this trinity of capabilities. The Zero carried no armor plating to protect its pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking the self-sealing technology that American and British aircraft incorporated. Its structural design prioritized lightness over resilience, using thin aluminum skin that could be punctured by rifle-caliber bullets. But in exchange for these vulnerabilities, it could outturn, outclimb, and outrange every fighter the Allies could field in 1941. In the hands of Japan's superbly trained naval aviators, men who had spent years perfecting their craft over China and the Pacific, it was the most lethal fighter aircraft in the world. American pilots who survived early encounters reported engagements that shattered every assumption their training had provided. The Zero could turn inside a P-40 Warhawk or an F-4F Wildcat in ways that seemed to violate physics. It could climb at angles that left Allied fighters stalling and falling. It had operational range that allowed it to appear hundreds of miles from any known Japanese base, striking without warning and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Reports from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from Java and Burma all told the same story. American and Allied pilots were dying in numbers that made the air war seem unwinnable. In January 1942, a young American pilot named Edward Butch O'Hare survived an encounter with Zeros over Rabaul and wrote in his after-action report with the stark honesty of a man who understood how close he had come to death. I said, "The Zero is not just a better aircraft, it is a different kind of aircraft. Everything we were taught about energy tactics and boom and zoom attacks fails when the enemy can follow you through maneuvers we cannot match. We are not fighting an opponent, we are fighting a fundamental disadvantage." His assessment was shared across every theater where American pilots faced the Zero. The aircraft had achieved something rare in warfare, psychological dominance so complete that merely seeing its profile produced a visceral fear response.
But warfare is not a static equation. It is a conversation conducted in blood and wreckage, and the side that learns fastest survives longest. While Japanese pilots celebrated their superiority through the winter and spring of 1942, certain developments were occurring that would eventually rewrite the terms of engagement entirely. On June 4, 1942, during the Battle of Midway, an event occurred that would prove more significant than any single aircraft's performance. A Zero fighter was recovered nearly intact from Akutan Island in Alaska. The aircraft had crash-landed after being damaged in an attack on Dutch Harbor, and its pilot, killed in the landing, had failed to destroy the plane as regulations required. When American salvage teams discovered it in July, they found an intelligence prize beyond measure, a complete, fully functional example of the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 7 months. The captured Zero was shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where it was repaired, test-flown, and systematically analyzed by a team that included combat pilots, engineers, and tacticians. Over the course of hundreds of test flights, American pilots flew the Zero against every fighter in the U.S. inventory, documenting its performance envelope with scientific precision. What they discovered was both alarming and enlightening. The Zero was indeed superior in certain aspects. Its turn rate and climb performance exceeded American fighters at most altitudes and speeds. But the testing also revealed something Japanese pilots had never acknowledged because their doctrine had never required them to consider it. The Zero had critical weaknesses that could be exploited by pilots who understood them and had the discipline to fight accordingly. At speeds above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces became heavy and unresponsive. Its roll rate at high speed was poor compared to American fighters. Its engine, while reliable and efficient, produced less power than American radios, meaning that in a straight-line dive, aircraft like the P-38 Lightning or the F-6F Hellcat could pull away. Most critically, its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a short burst from heavy machine guns, the .50 caliber Brownings that American fighters carried 6 or 8 of, could destroy it catastrophically, where American aircraft could absorb similar damage and continue fighting.
The testing program at North Island produced a document that would be distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. Tactical and Technical Trends, the Zero Fighter. It was less than 20 pages, but it contained information that would save thousands of American lives. The document detailed specific tactics. Never attempt to turn with a Zero at low speed. Use diving attacks and maintain speed through the engagement. Use superior power and dive performance to dictate when and where combat occurs. If caught in a disadvantageous position, dive away at full throttle rather than attempting to outmaneuver. These were not revolutionary tactics. They had been used in various forms since World War I, but applied with discipline against the Zero's specific weaknesses, they transformed the mathematics of survival. But knowledge alone was not enough. American pilots needed aircraft that could implement these tactics effectively, and in 1942 they were flying fighters designed for a different war. The F-4F Wildcat was rugged and reliable, but it was outperformed by the Zero in almost every category except diving speed and structural strength. What was needed was a new generation of fighters, aircraft that could match or exceed the Zero in enough categories to make tactical doctrine into battlefield reality. The answer came in multiple forms. The Vought F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wing and massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, began reaching combat squadrons in late 1942. It was faster than the Zero, could outdive it, and could absorb punishment that would have destroyed 3 Zeros. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, already in service, but initially troubled by mechanical issues in the Pacific's harsh environment, received modifications that made it a lethal high-altitude interceptor with speed and firepower the Zero could not match. And, perhaps most importantly, the Grumman F-6H Hellcat entered service in 1943, an aircraft that seemed designed specifically to implement the tactical lessons learned from the Akuten Zero. It was fast, heavily armed with 6.5 caliber machine guns, armored like a flying tank, and while it could not turn with a Zero at low speed, it did not need to. It could dictate the terms of engagement, and American pilots were finally being trained to do exactly that. The transformation of American fighter tactics was not instantaneous, nor was it universally implemented. There were pilots who, through inexperience or the fog of combat, violated the new doctrine and paid with their lives. There were units slow to receive the tactical bulletins, commanders skeptical of lessons learned in test flights rather than combat, and instances where individual courage attempted to substitute for systematic tactical advantage. But gradually, month by month, engagement by engagement, the balance shifted. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to air superiority began encountering something unexpected: American fighters that refused to fight on Japanese terms. They would swoop down from altitude, make a single high-speed pass, and if they did not achieve a kill, they would dive away before the Zero could bring its turning advantage to bear. If a Zero attempted to pursue, it would find itself outpaced in the dive, unable to close the distance before the American fighter extended away, climbed back to altitude, and repeated the process. It was frustrating, even dishonorable by the standards of Bushido. The Americans were refusing to engage in the pure test of aerial combat skill. But it was also devastatingly effective. The kill ratios, which had so favored Japan in 1941 and early 1942, began to equalize, then tipped the other direction. By late 1943, American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at rates that approached 2-to-1 in America's favor. By 1944, with the introduction of the Hellcat in large numbers and the systematic training of new pilots in the proven tactics, the ratio had widened to 5-to-1, then 10-to-1. The Zero, which had seemed invincible in 1941, was being swatted from the skies by pilots who understood that air combat was not about honor or individual skill alone. It was about systemic advantage, about creating situations where your strengths met the enemy's weaknesses.
But there was another factor, one that Japanese military planners had understood in abstract terms, but whose implications they had fatally underestimated: industrial capacity. By 1943, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate that seemed to violate economic logic. Where Japan could replace losses with perhaps 100 new aircraft per month, American factories were producing thousands. When a Japanese pilot shot down an American fighter, another appeared to take its place within days. When an experienced Japanese pilot was killed, and by 1943 Japan was losing its veteran pilots at an unsustainable rate, his replacement was a partially trained novice rushed to the front because there was no time for the years-long training programs that had created the elite pilots of 1941.
American pilot training, by contrast, had become systematized at a scale Japan could never match. New pilots received hundreds of hours of flight time before seeing combat. They practiced gunnery until deflection shots became instinctive. They flew against instructors who knew every Zero tactic because those instructors were combat veterans rotated home specifically to pass on their knowledge. The American military-industrial complex was not just producing aircraft, it was producing a renewable resource of trained pilots backed by tactical doctrine that improved with every engagement. There is a particular irony captured in a photograph taken in late 1944 aboard the carrier USS Lexington. It shows a row of F-6F Hellcats being serviced on the flight deck, their dark blue paint gleaming under tropical sun. In the foreground, a pilot's helmet rests on a wing, and tucked into the helmet's visor are pages from a worn tactical manual, the same manual that had originated from analysis of the Agile Zero. The symbolic weight is almost too perfect. American success in the Pacific Air War rested on a foundation built from a single captured enemy aircraft and the systematic analysis that followed. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had evolved. Japanese engineers had attempted updates. The A6M5 and later variants added some armor and slightly more powerful engines, but these modifications came too late and in too few numbers to matter. American fighters dominated Pacific skies so completely that Japanese air forces were reduced to kamikaze tactics, the desperate calculus of men who knew they could no longer win through conventional means and chose to make their deaths into weapons. The aircraft that had seemed unstoppable in 1941 had become, by 1945, a symbol of Japan's inability to match American industrial and tactical evolution. The statistical record tells the story with brutal clarity. From 1941 through 1942, Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios that ranged from 3-to-1 to as high as 5-to-1 in their favor. From 1943 through 1945, that ratio reversed and then magnified. American pilots flying Hellcats achieved an overall kill-to-loss ratio of 19-to-1 against all Japanese aircraft types. The F-4U Corsair achieved 11-to-1. Even the P-38 Lightning, initially troubled in the Pacific theater, achieved 2-to-1. The Zero, which had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft in 1941 and 1942, was being destroyed at rates that approached 30-to-1 by war's end. These numbers represent more than tactical evolution. They represent a collision of two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. The Japanese model emphasized individual excellence, spiritual commitment, and technological optimization towards specific performance parameters. It produced superb pilots flying superb aircraft, and in the war's opening phase, this approach seemed vindicated. But it was a system that could not scale, could not adapt, and could not sustain losses. Once its advantages were neutralized by enemy understanding, and once its trained pilots were killed in numbers that exceeded replacement capacity, the entire system collapsed. The American model was almost diametrically opposed. It emphasized systematic training at scale, tactical doctrine that could be taught and learned rather than perfected through years of experience, and aircraft designed not for optimal performance in specific parameters, but for overall combat effectiveness. It produced pilots who were individually less skilled than the Japanese counterparts in 1941, but who were supported by an institutional system that made individual skill less determinative of outcome. And critically, it was a system that could learn from failure, could absorb catastrophic losses, and could emerge stronger because its foundation was not individual excellence, but renewable industrial and human resources.
This was the deeper lesson of the Zero's rise and fall. The aircraft itself was a magnificent machine, perhaps the finest expression of its particular design philosophy ever built. But warfare is not conducted by individual machines. It is conducted by systems of machines, tactics, training, industry, and national resources. The Zero's early dominance was real, but it was also temporary, a brief moment when Japanese advantages aligned perfectly against Allied weaknesses. Once those weaknesses were understood and corrected, once American pilots learned to fight on terms that favored their aircraft's strengths rather than the Zero's, and once American industry began producing fighters and pilots at scales Japan could never match, the outcome became mathematical. On September 2, 1945, as surrender documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a flight of F-6F Hellcats circled overhead in the autumn sky. They were there as guards, as symbols of American air superiority, and perhaps as a final irony. These aircraft, these descendants of the tactical lessons learned from a single captured Zero on an Alaskan island, represented the end point of a transformation that had taken less than 4 years. The pilots flying them were, many of them, men who had never seen a Zero in combat except as it attempted to flee or as it burned on its way to the ocean below. In the decades that followed, military historians and aviation enthusiasts would debate the Zero's place in the pantheon of great fighter aircraft. Some would argue that it was the finest fighter of its era, undone only by Japan's industrial limitations and the tactical evolution of its opponents. Others would argue that its design flaws, the lack of armor, the fragile structure, made it a fundamentally unsound design that only succeeded when flown by exceptional pilots against inferior opposition. Both arguments contain truth, but both miss the larger point. The Zero's story is not about whether it was a good or bad aircraft. It is about the difference between optimization and adaptation, between perfection and resilience. Japanese designers had optimized the Zero to be the perfect expression of their tactical doctrine in 1939. American designers, starting from behind, created aircraft that were good enough to survive while their pilots learned, and then created new aircraft that incorporated those lessons. The Zero remained, until the war's end, superior to American fighters in certain specific ways, but those ways ceased to matter once American pilots understood they did not need to engage on those terms.
The symbolic object in this story is not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It is a document. Those 20 pages of tactical analysis derived from the Akutan Zero, distributed across the Pacific, read and reread by pilots who internalized its lessons and survived because of them. In that document and in the systematic process that produced it lay the essence of American military philosophy. Not individual heroism, though there was heroism in abundance, not technological superiority, though that would come, but something more fundamental, the ability to face defeat, analyze its causes, distribute that knowledge systematically, and implement solutions at scale. The wind still moves across Akutan Island, where the Zero that changed the war lies in pieces somewhere beneath decades of grass and weather. The pilots who flew that fighter, both the Japanese lieutenant who died there and the American test pilots who later flew it at North Island, are gone now, as are most of the men who fought the air war over the Pacific. What remains is the lesson they collectively wrote, often without knowing they were writing it, that in modern warfare, the advantage belongs not to the side with the best technology at war's beginning, but to the side with the best system for making their technology obsolete and replacing it with something better. The Zeros that dominated in December 1941 were still flying in August 1945, still trying to turn inside American fighters that had learned not to let them. And in that persistent attempt to fight a war that no longer existed, using tactics that no longer worked, against an enemy that had learned every weakness, in that lies the final tragedy and the final lesson of the aircraft that was both the best and worst fighter of World War II.